At our wedding, while everyone cheered and clinked glasses, my husband leaned close, smiled for the cameras, and whispered into my ear, "You're nothing." I swallowed the pain, stood tall, and let him enjoy his moment of triumph. He thought he had broken me. What he didn't know was that I was already preparing his downfall, and when the time was right, I shattered his world in a way he never saw coming. This is the story of a bride's deepest humiliation, and the brutal twist that turned his arrogance into ashes. Hello, family. Welcome back. Before we begin, I have a small but heartfelt request. Please subscribe. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Every time you click that button, you're helping us share voices that would otherwise be forgotten, and stories that deserve to be heard. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from, because together, we are not just telling stories, we are keeping hope alive. The church bells rang across the small town, their echoes bouncing against the sky like an announcement of joy. Inside the cathedral, every pew was filled. The air smelled of roses, candle wax, and expensive perfume. Guests whispered to each other about how beautiful the bride looked, how grand the ceremony was, and how lucky Eleanor Brooks must feel to be marrying Richard Hale. Eleanor, Ellie to her friends, stood at the entrance, her white gown glowing in the light of the stained glass windows. Her heart beat hard in her chest, not from nerves, but from the heavy silence inside her soul. She had dreamed of this day since she was a little girl, but never like this. Her groom, Richard, stood tall at the altar, his smile polished for the cameras. His dark hair was neatly combed, his suit pressed to perfection. He looked every bit the wealthy heir to the Hale family empire. When their eyes met, he smiled wider, a smile so convincing that the crowd sighed with admiration. Ellie forced herself to return the smile. She walked down the aisle slowly, each step echoing like a drum beat in her ears. She thought of her late father and her modest upbringing. She thought of her mother, sitting in the front row, clutching a tissue, proud but nervous. And she thought of the whispers she had overheard before the wedding. She's from nothing. She'll never fit in with the Hales. This marriage won't last a year. But she kept her chin high. Today, she would prove them wrong. The ceremony moved forward, rings exchanged, vows spoken, kisses sealed under the flash of cameras. Richard held her hand like a man deeply in love, squeezing it gently as if to say, "We belong together." To the guests, it looked like perfection. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the room erupted in applause. Glasses clinked, voices rose in cheer, and Ellie thought, maybe, just maybe, this was her new beginning. But then came the dance. The ballroom was glowing with golden lights, chandeliers hanging high above, music drifting softly from the string quartet. Richard led Ellie to the center, his arm around her waist, his other hand holding hers with practiced grace. Cameras clicked. Guests stood to watch, and Margaret Hale, Richard's mother, sat like a queen on her throne, watching her new daughter-in-law with cold, sharp eyes. Richard leaned in, his face so close it looked tender, even loving. To anyone watching, it was a picture of romance, but the words that left his lips cut like glass. "You're nothing," he whispered, his smile never faltering. "You'll never be one of us." Ellie's heart stopped. For a second, she thought she had misheard him. The music swelled around them, people clapped to the rhythm, and Richard kept swaying her across the floor as if nothing had happened. But his voice, soft and cruel, stayed in her ear. "You heard me," he murmured again, pressing his cheek to hers for the cameras. "Smile, darling. Don't embarrass yourself." Her hand trembled in his. She forced her lips into a smile so convincing it could fool anyone. But inside she felt the floor breaking beneath her feet. Ellie looked into his eyes, searching for some sign of warmth, some trace of the man she thought she had married. But all she saw was arrogance. He wasn't just humiliating her. He was enjoying it. The applause of the guests grew louder. The clinking of glasses filled the hall. "Kiss her again!" someone shouted, and Richard obeyed, pressing his lips to hers with showman-like perfection. The crowd cheered, blind to the poison that had just been poured into her soul. Ellie's chest burned with shame, but she didn't let a single tear fall. She would not cry in front of them, not in front of Margaret, who already doubted her, and not in front of Richard, who clearly wanted to see her break. As the dance ended, Richard bowed slightly, escorting her back to the head table. He kissed her hand for the crowd's benefit and whispered once more, his voice so low only she could hear, "Don't forget, Ellie. You're only here because I allow it." Ellie sat down, her fingers gripping the edge of the table under the white cloth. The pain in her chest was sharp, but beneath it, something else stirred. It was quiet, small, but powerful, like the first rumble before a storm. She looked around the ballroom, her eyes scanning the faces of the rich and powerful people who laughed and toasted. They saw her as the lucky bride, the outsider who had caught the golden sun of the Hale family. They didn't see her humiliation. They didn't hear his words. But one day, they would. For now, she would play her role. She would smile. She would nod. She would let Richard enjoy his triumph. But deep inside, a vow was forming. If Richard believed she was nothing, then he would soon learn what nothing was capable of. The reception carried on like a dream for everyone else. Waiters floated across the room with trays of champagne. Laughter echoed under the chandeliers. The Hale family's wealth dripped from every corner. The crystal glasses, the gold-rimmed plates, even the flowers flown in from France. Ellie sat at the long table, smiling for the endless stream of cameras. Her cheeks ached, but she didn't dare stop. Richard leaned back in his chair, laughing with his friends, while she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Every now and then he would squeeze her hand under the table, hard enough to remind her that he was in control. Then he would look up and kiss her cheek in front of the crowd, drawing sighs from the women who whispered, "What a perfect couple." But Ellie knew the truth now. "Eleanor," Margaret Hale said suddenly from across the table, her voice smooth but sharp, "you must feel overwhelmed. All of this grandeur, surely it's more than you ever imagined." Ellie turned to her mother-in-law, forcing a polite smile. "It is beautiful. I'm grateful to be here." Margaret's lips curled, not quite a smile. "Grateful. Yes, that's the right word. Richard has given you so much." She lifted her glass. "Let's all toast to Richard, for being so generous." The table laughed and clinked glasses. Ellie felt the heat rise in her face. The words weren't spoken, cruelly, but the message was clear. You don't belong. You should thank him for choosing you. Richard smirked, raising his glass with the others. He didn't defend her. He didn't need to. He wanted her small. Ellie's mother, sitting a few chairs away, lowered her gaze. She had warned Ellie that the Hales were different, that wealth changes people. But Ellie had brushed it off. She had wanted to believe Richard loved her for who she was. Now the weight of her mistake pressed down on her chest. As the night went on, the conversations around her grew louder, the laughter bolder. Richard's friends leaned across the table, making jokes Ellie didn't understand, inside references to private, vacations and business deals. They barely looked at her, as if she were invisible. When one of them finally addressed her, it was with a smirk. "So, Ellie, what's it like going from, what was it, a teacher's daughter, to marrying into this?" He gestured around the ballroom like a magician showing off a trick. The group burst into laughter. Richard chuckled too, shaking his head. "Be kind," he said. Though his tone wasn't protective, it was mocking. "She's still adjusting." Ellie clenched her fists under the table. She wanted to scream, to throw the crystal glass at the wall. But instead, She smiled. "I'm adjusting just fine," she said softly. "Thank you for asking." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly disappointed he hadn't gotten a bigger reaction. The night dragged on. Ellie endured the toasts, the shallow compliments, the quiet cruelty disguised as charm. But all the while, her mind returned to Richard's whisper. "You're nothing. You'll never be one of us." His words repeated like an echo, but instead of breaking her, they started to harden her. Toward the end of the night, Richard leaned close again, pretending to nuzzle her ear for the cameras. His words were coated in sugar, but they cut just the same. "Smile bigger, Ellie. Don't look so nervous. People are watching. I'm fine," she whispered back. He chuckled under his breath. "Good girl." Her body stiffened. Good girl, like she was a pet, a decoration, a doll on display. Ellie glanced across the room at Margaret, who was whispering to an older guest. Margaret's eyes flicked toward Ellie briefly, and Ellie could see the judgment in them. To Margaret, she was nothing but a poor girl who had climbed too high, someone to be tolerated, never respected. But Margaret didn't know. Richard didn't know. No one in that grand hall knew. Ellie wasn't as powerless as they thought. She smiled for the cameras once more, raising her glass for the final toast of the night. Her voice was steady as she said, "To family. May it always stand strong." The guests cheered. Richard kissed her hand again. To them it looked like love. But inside, Ellie's vow burned brighter. She would not cry tonight. She would not crumble. She would play the role of the grateful bride, the outsider who married into a golden world. But deep in her heart, she promised herself one thing. They would regret underestimating her. For now, she would be nothing. But one day soon, that nothing would bring the Hales to their knees. If you haven't subscribed yet, we'd love for you to join our community by hitting the subscribe button. Through our stories, we build hope and give a future to children and women who have been abused all over the world. Motivate us by subscribing and turning on your notification bell so you never miss a story that matters. Also, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from and how did this story speak to you? The honeymoon glow never came. To the outside world, Richard and Eleanor Hale looked like the picture of happiness. He held her hand at family dinners, smiled for the cameras at charity events, and boasted to his friends about his beautiful bride. Whenever they appeared in public, Richard draped an arm around her shoulders, whispering things that made her blush on cue. He was the perfect husband in the eyes of everyone else. But behind the mansion's tall gates, behind the heavy oak doors of their home, the mask slipped. It started small. Snide remarks dropped casually, as though they were jokes. "You're lucky, Ellie," he would say at breakfast, sipping his coffee. "Most girls in your position would have been thrilled to land someone like me. Don't forget where you came from." Or he would glance at her books when she tried reading at night. Literature? That's cute. But let's be honest, you don't really belong in the same world as the people I do business with. You wouldn't understand. When she tried to brush it off, he only pushed harder. "Don't take it personally. It's not your fault. I didn't marry you for your mind, Ellie. I married you because appearances matter. You fit the image." That's enough. Ellie would retreat into silence, her chest tight, her hands cold. She had thought marriage would bring her closer to Richard. Instead, it felt like she had been locked in a glass case, looked at, admired, but never respected. Margaret Hale, Richard's mother, made things worse. Margaret visited often, sweeping into the house like she owned it, which in a sense she did. She never raised her voice, never openly insulted Ellie, but her words carried poison all the same. "You must be adjusting," Margaret would say, looking around Ellie's sitting room with critical eyes. "I suppose it's difficult for someone from your background. Or, Richard has always been generous. He sees something in you, and for that, you should be grateful. Not everyone would be so patient, Every sentence was a reminder that Ellie was an outsider, a charity project the Hales had decided to tolerate. One evening, Margaret leaned across the table at dinner and said, "My dear, don't be offended, but you must understand. Women like us carry the family name. Women like you support it. There's a difference." Richard smirked at his plate. He didn't correct her. He never did. Ellie smiled tightly, hiding her hurt. But inside, she felt herself unraveling. It was Samantha Clark who broke her. Samantha had been her bridesmaid, her confidant, her best friend since college. She was the one who helped Ellie pick her wedding dress, who stood beside her when the vows were spoken. Ellie had trusted her more than anyone. One afternoon, Ellie returned home early from a charity event. She moved quietly through the house, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She was about to call out for Richard when she heard laughter, low, intimate laughter, coming from his office. She froze outside the door. Richard's voice, Samantha's voice, a muffled gasp, a moan. Ellie's blood ran cold. She pressed her hand against the door, every muscle in her body trembling. The sound of her best friend's voice, breathy, soft, filled with desire, cut deeper than any blade. She staggered backward, her chest heaving, her vision blurred as she stumbled down the hall into her bedroom and locked the door. The betrayal was unbearable. Her husband, her best friend, in her own home. Tears streamed down her face as she slid to the floor, her gown wrinkling around her. She wanted to scream, to break something, to tear the walls apart with her bare hands, but no sound came, only silence. When she finally confronted Richard days later, he laughed. "Are you serious?" he scoffed, lounging in his chair. "You're imagining things, Ellie." "Samantha, she's like a sister to me." "I heard you," Ellie whispered, her hands shaking. Richard leaned forward, his eyes cold. "No, you didn't. You're paranoid. Do you want people to think you're crazy? Because that's how it sounds." Margaret, who was sitting nearby, chimed in smoothly. "Eleanor, jealousy is not a good look. A wife should be confident. If you accuse Richard without proof, you'll only embarrass yourself." Ellie's mouth opened, but no words came. They looked at her like she was unstable, fragile, pathetic. Word spread quickly through the family. Soon, Richard's sisters and cousins were whispering about her. At dinners, she noticed the side glances, the tight smiles. She was no longer seen as the graceful new bride, but as the insecure wife who didn't know her place. The humiliation was suffocating. That night, Ellie locked herself in her bedroom. She buried her face in her pillow, sobbing until her body ached. She cried for the girl she used to be, for the love she thought she had, for the friends she thought she could trust. She felt utterly alone. But then, through the tears, through the suffocating weight of betrayal, something flickered. A memory. The hidden secret she had been keeping. It was something Richard didn't know. Something Margaret couldn't touch. Something Samantha could never steal. Ellie sat up slowly, wiping her face with trembling hands. The pain was still there, sharp as ever, but underneath it, she felt a spark of power. They thought she was nothing. They thought they could break her. But they didn't know the truth. Not yet. Betrayal often comes from those closest to you, but truth has a way of surviving even the deepest lies. Ellie wasn't as blind as Richard thought. Long before she stood in that cathedral wearing her wedding dress, she had seen the cracks in his perfect mask. She had known. It had been a cold November evening when she first discovered the truth. She had stopped by Richard's office unexpectedly, carrying dinner she had cooked for him. She thought it would be a sweet surprise. But as she walked up the marble steps, she saw him through the glass wall of his office, his body pressed against Samantha's, his lips on hers. Ellie froze, her heart lurching into her throat. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. She turned and walked away quietly, the dinner bag still clutched in her trembling hands. That night, she cried until her chest hurt. But when the tears ran out, something else replaced them. A strange, steady calm. If she exposed him then, the wedding would be called off. People would whisper about her failure, about how foolish she had been to believe a Hale could truly love her. Richard would spin the story, and she would walk away humiliated. No, that wasn't enough. Richard wanted her broken. He wanted her to play the part of the weak, naive wife. Instead, she would play a different role. She would be patient. She would let him think he was untouchable, and then she would strike when it hurt most. From that moment on, Ellie began building her web. Her first weapon was information. She started small, saving every text Richard accidentally left on his unlocked phone, every careless email that hinted at his affair with Samantha. She hired a discreet investigator, using money left from her late father's estate, to follow Richard when he claimed he was working late. Within weeks, she had a folder full of photographs, Richard and Samantha in hotels, in restaurants, even in the back of Richard's car. But Ellie didn't stop there. She remembered something her father once told her before he passed. Power isn't always about money. Sometimes it's about knowing something others will do anything to keep hidden. Richard thought he was marrying her for love, or at least that's the story he told. But Ellie knew the truth. Her father had owned a company, modest compared to the Hale empire, but valuable nonetheless. When he passed, Ellie inherited his shares. At the time, she didn't understand what they meant. But soon, she realized Richard's family desperately needed those shares to finalize a huge merger. Without them, the Hale empire would lose billions. Richard had chosen her not because she was special, but because she was useful, and he thought she was too naive to realize it. Ellie almost laughed when she pieced it together. He had underestimated her so deeply that he never saw the danger in marrying her. Then came the second layer of her web, Margaret. One afternoon, while sorting through the Hale family's old records in the library, Ellie stumbled across documents tucked in a drawer, financial transfers, dates, and signatures. At first they meant nothing, but when she quietly checked them against public records, she uncovered a scandal. Margaret Hale had been funneling money through a shell account, covering up a tax fraud case that, if exposed, would ruin her reputation and possibly land her in court. Ellie sat at her desk staring at the papers for a long time. She had never wanted to be this kind of woman, the kind who plotted in the shadows. But Richard had forced her hand. Piece by piece, she wove her net tighter, evidence of Richard's betrayal, proof of Margaret's corruption, control over her father's company shares. She wasn't powerless anymore. She was holding the matches to burn down the Hale empire. But Ellie didn't reveal any of it. Not yet. Instead, she played her role with perfect precision. In public, she was the smiling wife, laughing at Richard's jokes, dressing beautifully for his events. She kissed him on the cheek when cameras flashed, held his hand when reporters asked about their marriage, and pretended not to notice when Samantha's name slipped too often into conversations. At dinners, she listened silently while Margaret corrected her table manners or mocked her small-town background. She endured the whispers from Richard's cousins, the smug smiles from Samantha. Everyone thought she was weak, broken, a foolish bride clinging to her rich husband. Ellie let them believe it. She needed them to believe it. Because only then would her revenge strike like lightning out of a clear sky. Late at night, when Richard thought she was asleep, Ellie would slip quietly into her study. She opened her laptop and checked her files. Photographs of Richard and Samantha kissing. Bank statements showing his hotel payments. Voice recordings of Richard mocking her to his friends. She replayed one recording often, not out of pain anymore, but as fuel. "She's nothing," Richard's voice sneered through the speakers. "She's just a placeholder until I get full control of her father's shares." Ellie would sit back in her chair, her lips curling into the faintest smile. Let's see who's nothing, she whispered to the dark. The weeks passed. The wedding came closer. Richard grew smugger, Margaret crueler, Samantha bolder, and Ellie grew quieter. Her silence fooled them all. They thought she was retreating further into weakness. In reality, she was sharpening her knife. On the morning of the wedding, as the stylists pinned her veil, Ellie stared at her reflection. Everyone saw a bride. But beneath the silk and lace, she knew she was a weapon. By the time Richard whispered, "You're nothing," during their first dance, Ellie already knew her answer. She just wasn't ready to say it. Not yet. The Hale family's downfall would not come in whispers. It would come in thunder. The night of the reception after-party drew closer. Richard thought it was his victory lap, his crowning moment of triumph, the night he would stand above everyone with Ellie at his side as his trophy. Ellie smiled sweetly whenever he spoke of it. She played along as Margaret gushed about the investors attending. She even let Samantha hug her, fake tears shining in her eyes, but in her mind she was counting down the hours. Everything was ready. The photographs, the recordings, the financial papers, his father's shares. Every piece of the puzzle had been arranged. Richard thought he had broken her. But really, she had been setting the stage for the performance of her life. The underestimated often hold the greatest power because no one sees them coming. And when the curtain rose at the after-party, Richard Hale would never see what hit him. The underestimated often hold the greatest power because no one sees them coming. It had been 6 weeks since the wedding. 6 weeks of Richard playing the perfect husband in public and the cruel stranger behind closed doors. 6 weeks of Margaret's quiet scorn, of whispers in the Hale household that Eleanor Hale, Ellie, to the ones who dared to pity her, was already a disappointment. Tonight was supposed to be Richard's grand moment. The Hales were hosting a lavish dinner at the family estate, the kind of event where business and bloodlines mixed seamlessly. Investors filled the hall, their suits sharp, their smiles sharper. Family members gathered at the long oak table, crystal glasses sparkling under the chandelier. Waiters in black uniforms moved like shadows, refilling champagne flutes and carrying silver trays. It was the night Richard planned to announce the final steps of the Hale merger, the deal that would cement his power and expand the family empire. Ellie stood at the far end of the room, her white silk gown gliding as she moved. She smiled politely, her face the perfect mask of grace. Richard hadn't even noticed her silence. He was too busy boasting to his investors, too busy letting Samantha's hand linger on his sleeve when she leaned in to whisper. Yes, Samantha was there. Bold, brazen, laughing too loudly at Richard's jokes, her eyes sparkling as if she belonged at his side more than Ellie ever did. Ellie's chest burned, but her expression never faltered. Richard finally stood, raising his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rich with confidence. "Tonight is more than just a dinner. It is a promise of the Hale legacy continuing stronger than ever." Polite applause filled the room. Richard's smile widened. "And none of this would be possible without the support of my family. And of course, my beautiful wife." He turned to Ellie, his grin smug, his hand extended. "Ellie, darling, why don't you join me for a toast?" The room turned toward her. Ellie walked slowly to his side, her heels clicking softly against the marble. She accepted the glass he handed her, her fingers brushing his briefly. He smirked, whispering so only she could hear. "Smile. Nothing. Don't embarrass me." Ellie lifted her glass, her voice clear and calm. "A toast. To Richard Hale, the man who told me, on our wedding day, that I am nothing." The hall fell silent. Forks clattered against plates. Samantha's smile froze on her lips. Richard's face went pale. Ellie lowered her glass slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room. "But tonight I want to show him, and all of you, what nothing can do." With that, She clicked the small remote she had hidden in her hand. The projector at the end of the hall lit up. The first photo appeared, Richard and Samantha, hand in hand, entering a hotel. Gasps echoed through the hall. The next, the two of them kissing in his car. Then a recording played, Richard's own voice filling the room. "She's nothing. Just a placeholder until I get her father's shares." The investors stiffened. Margaret's glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor. Samantha's face went white as whispers rippled through the room like wildfire. Richard lunged forward. "Turn it off! Ellie, stop this now!" But Ellie stepped back, her eyes steady, her voice calm. "Why should I stop?" "You wanted me humiliated, Richard. Let's show them the truth instead." She clicked again. Another recording. Richard mocking Ellie at a bar with his friends. "She's not even my type. She should be grateful I married her. She owes me." The room buzzed with disgust. An investor muttered, "Unbelievable." Another whispered to his colleague, "This is who we trusted." Richard's mask cracked. "This is all fake. Edited. She's lying." Ellie ignored him. She reached into the envelope she carried and held up a stack of documents. "You all came tonight expecting Richard to announce the merger. But what Richard didn't tell you is that my late father's shares, the ones he needs to complete the deal, are mine, and I have already sold them." The room erupted. "To your rivals," Ellie added firmly, "effective immediately." Gasps turned to chaos. Investors slammed fists on the table. Some stood furious. Others shook their heads in disgust. "You lied to us, Richard," one of them spat. "You've been stringing us along." "No!" Richard shouted, his face red. This is a trick. Ellie, tell them you're joking." But Ellie's voice cut like steel. "This is no joke. The merger is dead. And so is your empire." Richard stumbled back, his chest heaving. "You can't do this to me." Ellie's eyes narrowed. "I just did." And then she turned her gaze to Margaret. "As for you, Margaret." She dropped another stack of papers on the table. "I found your shell accounts. Your little cover-up. Your fraud. How much prison time do you think tax evasion brings these days?" Margaret's face drained of colour. She opened her mouth, but no words came. For the first time, she looked powerless. Richard reached for Ellie, desperation breaking his voice. "Ellie, please, don't do this. We can fix it. Don't destroy me like this." She met his eyes, her expression calm. For once, she wasn't trembling. She wasn't crying. She was untouchable. "You told me I'm nothing," she said softly, her voice carrying across the hall. "Tonight, I showed you what nothing can do." She turned, her gown trailing behind her like a banner of war.